Hello and welcome to today's LinkedIn Live program as we explore supply chain best practice in the cable industry with our topic, Reel Chaos. We're talking about how to keep track of your cable reels and boost efficiency, brought to you by my friends at the Antares Vision Group, the real experts in supply chain and technology. Hello, I'm your host, Bill Wall, and I've worked in the enterprise software and data space for more than 20 years, and I'm ever fascinated by the intersection of business and technology. And no matter what industry you work in, managing materials and the carriers that transport materials is mission critical for supply chain management. I've been fortunate to cover the latest in technology deployed to address these critical issues out at the edge and into the core back-end ERP solutions. And it continues to amaze me how best practices in supply chain can be addressed across industries. Today, we'll dig into proven strategies to optimize cable inventory and track reel locations indoors and out, leveraging serialized barcodes, QR codes, and RFID tags, and how that data can be leveraged for more efficient operations. Now, today's conversation is an interactive one, so I encourage all of you that are tuning in to participate. Use today's webinar platform to do a couple of things. Give us your name, title, and where you're located so we get a sense of who's joining us today. And use the same comments area to post any questions you'd like to ask throughout our program, and we'll try to address them during the course of our time together. So let's begin with some context. We have a short video to get us underway, so let's go to the video. Great, and it brings us to the official start of our program. My most productive conversations have been with my friends at Axis, now part of the Antares Vision Group, so it's my pleasure to welcome a regular guest of mine, Chief Strategy Officer John DePaulo, to the program. John, so good to talk with you again.
You as well, Bill. That's always good to sit down and have a conversation about things going on in the supply chain.
Well, excellent. So let's start with the basics. As usual, John, I know enough to be just a little bit dangerous, having worked in the ERP space at SAP for many years. But I was also in the radio industry and became familiar with how large transmission cables were shipped on these 10 to 12 foot diameter cable reels. And they often find themselves sitting in laydown yards or in the storage yards of the sub vendors on major projects. And when these projects sort of wrap up, these construction sites linger for a long time, and these reels wind up laying in the dirt somewhere and occasionally wind up in somebody's backyard as a play set for kids. But these are valuable items. They're assets to the business. How big of a challenge is this in the cable reel industry?
Yeah, and I think it's a formidable challenge, and it's not different from other industries that use returnable assets, in the delivery of their products, right? So you get a lot of focus on the product itself, and then the carrier. I don't want to say it gets, kind of lost in the shuffle, but it becomes somewhat secondary to tracking, right? Mm-hmm. So you wind up with these expensive assets, so these cable reels, are very expensive, and they take up space. And they need to be stored, and as you wind up having, either more than you need or don't have them in the right place, it becomes a challenge, right? And it's a challenge for companies from a capital perspective that they're laying out. It's a challenge from a storage perspective. And then there's all of these follow-on challenges, that can happen around the manufacturing and distribution of the actual product.
I think about many of the conversations we've had, John, about returnable asset management. And often one of the challenges is there is only a limited number of these carriers of product. I remember we had a great conversation about automotive parts supply chain. And one of the challenges there, and we've even talked about it in bread manufacturing, if the carriers don't return to the factory, there's no way to store, host, move, and transport the next round of finished goods. At some point, there's not an exhaustible supply of carriers. So it's not just a financial asset. It really gets into how do you keep the supply chain continually flowing? That's true in the cable industry as well.
Correct. And what we see in the cable industry, other industries, is this always catching up process,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, just as an example, I have 20 reels that I have for a particular production run of product. I send those out to be consumed, uh, and I expect to get them back, in a certain period of time. And yes, I may build in some slack time or some buffer around that. But then what happens when I don't get them back over a period of time? And as you mentioned, these projects are large, and oftentimes they take long periods of time. So it's kind of easy for these things to kind of get lost in the shuffle. And then what happens when I don't get the expected number that I need back from a future production perspective? I only have two choices, right? I can either send manual labor out to go find them, or start to dial
Mm-hmm.
the phone and send emails and things like that to customers, or I can buy more, right? And then when I buy more, now I have the issue of I've spent excess capital to buy
Yep.
more. Um, and then what do I do when I start to get the ones back that I didn't get back that I bought more to replace, right? So now I have storage scenarios, and do I dispose of them? Kind of there's all these follow-on situations that happen, not to mention the fact of the impact from a production perspective of, am I available to, do I have product available to ship to customers, or does that get delayed, right? So it's this continual, sliding effect of issues that happen because I don't have the right carriers at the right point in time.
And this is an interesting industry because while there may be carriers for small gauge products that are plastic in nature and relatively briefcase sized or chair sized, when you get up into transmission lines and electric utilities, these cable reels are not something you just go pick up with a guy in a pickup truck. They involve heavy equipment to be moved, they require specialized transportation. So the whole process of returnable becomes an expense that has to be managed. And I would imagine, I'll pose the question to you, makes this issue of returnable asset management even more critical.
Absolutely. And being able to put intelligence behind the flow of product, right, and the flow of these assets, and the expectation, and proactively manage them, right?
Mm.
So it's a much different discussion that you have, potentially with your end customers or the end users of your product, if as a part of kind of the shipment of goods, you start to work with them on the return of those assets, right? So it's a proactive partnership, and they understand that you're tracking, and you understand that you're tracking, and you have systems behind
Mhm.
it that are doing it. I think that makes for a much better process, than shipping them out. Yes, granted, maybe you take a deposit, on the reel, and if you don't get it back, the customer gets charged the deposit, or you keep the money. But that doesn't help your production process,
Mhm.
and that doesn't help your customer satisfaction, because you can't ship on time for a subsequent order because you didn't have the carrier necessary to do it.
Interesting. I was going to ask about deposit return because obviously, with the largest and most expensive of these types of reels, there's a financial component for the customer, but that also adds a data point that the supply chain management system has to watch out for. And so the presumption would be that an asset management software would help the customer track the status of deposits, signal to the ERP system to make returns on deposits or to invoice for non-return goods. That all has to go into the thinking of how to build a business process around this, right?
It does. And yes, that can be effective. But where we run into problems, and what we've seen, again, cross industry, is how do you prove it? right? I said that I sent you 5, and 5 came back, and that's great. But then we start to get into the discussion, which is a hallmark of the way that we think about things, is this concept of unique identification, not only for the product but for the asset itself, so that you can start to work with your customers on, I didn't send you 5 reels, I sent you these 5 reels.
Right.
And then I can mark when they came back, and I can understand that. And I just have tighter control over how the flow works. And I can integrate that also back into my own production, distribution, and receiving process.
And I would imagine for a cable manufacturer, their yard for raw materials may have hundreds of these reels, either in process being loaded or being returned. And so just managing the in-house locations and inventory of those reels becomes a component of supply chain management.
Certainly. And again, across industry, this industry included, you often need to have the right carrier for a particular product and for a particular production run. And in these large yards, where you have hundreds or thousands of carriers scattered about, one of the other things is, can I quickly identify and move to production to issue a reel to production, issue the right reel or the right type of reel, and be able to quickly identify that and know where they are, even in my own facility. And that's a challenge that we see, not only for reels, but other types of returnable assets as well.
We've talked often, John, across our many conversations about how to capture that data out at the edge. And one of the fascinating things is the challenge of whether they be asset tags or active tags like RFID tags, goes to size, and typically size goes to cost. As we start to talk about cable reels, which begin to get significant in size, that opens up some flexibility for the location of tags. Many of these reels will stay outside for long periods of times at construction projects. So for an active tag, like an RFID tag, battery life becomes important. Can you discuss a little bit about the technology of tagging out at the edge?
Absolutely. Because that's been kind of the stoppage of many projects in the past, right? Is the dream of being able to pinpoint where things are, and quickly identify them, was often stopped by the current technology of the day, right? So even if we go back a year, 2, 3, 4 years, and you looked at an active RFID tag as an example, the battery life was challenging around that. It was measured in days to months, and what we really needed is technology that could be measured in multiple year increments, right? Because what we don't want to do is add another task to asset managers to replace active RFID technology every year, as an example. So where we've come to now are RFID-based, GPS-based tags with battery lives of 5, 6, 7, 10 years, that can ping multiple times a day, or when an asset is moved, as an example. So there's new sensor technology that has been built that allows us to do that. And then the other change that we're seeing, and there's a couple of companies that we work with that are trying to disrupt the network of how do I pay for this connectivity, by really having low cost connectivity across cellular networks, where you're not having individual subscriptions for individual reels that you need to deal with. So that is changing as well. So we've spoke with many people who have looked at projects in the past and said, no, it's just not feasible, either from a technology perspective or from a cost perspective. And I think it's time to start to relook at that, because the industrial IoT space has changed significantly and continues to change significantly over time. And there's a lot of new technology and ways of looking at it that are available now that weren't available 5 years ago.
As you watch these customer projects unfold, certainly RFID tagging has been at the forefront of powered tags, live tags. Certainly in a lot of these inventory yards, particularly for the equipment that has to be moved by forklift and machine, there's typically an operator with a reader or scanner. Are active versus inert tags, whether they be barcode or some other form of readable tags, do they tend to be the priority for most customers, or are people really looking for real-time scanning even while it's in transport?
Yeah, I mean, I think the predominant focus that we are seeing is in passive technology, as opposed to active
Mm,
technology. And I do think that there is a lot of capabilities around doing mixed technology, right?
mhm.
And I think that's a very important thing that people should think about. If you have a very expensive asset or a large reel, it can justify its own active tag that
Yep.
sits on it and tells you where it is. If you have a whole series of smaller, reels or returnable assets that you're dealing with, you may not be able to justify active technology for every one of those, but maybe you look at a grouping of passive technology along with a single active tag or something along those lines.
Mhm.
And it's something that we think about and talk about with our customers, is this multimodal approach of identifying items, right? So all items, in my opinion, even active RFID tags still should be identified with a barcode or a QR code or something along those lines, so that a casual user, or a user who's doing inspections or other things can still identify that asset, utilizing their phone or utilizing a mobile device, and get the same information that they would get if they interrogated it with an RFID reader.
It's certainly fascinating to me that many of the things we've discussed on today's program really apply to multiple industries. In the end, getting that information from out at the edge, what's happening in the field, back into ERP systems so that they become integral to the business process is really what the Diamine family of supply chain solutions is all about. The presumption is your team, as well as partners in specific industries, really can work hand in hand with customers to figure out a technology strategy that's unique for them. Because we know even companies I learned this in many years of working at SAP, even companies in the same industry will operate business processes differently. And certainly their solutions for super large, expensive reels would be very different from less expensive, small size plastic reels. What's the best way to collect the right team of experts around a project like this?
Yeah, a great question. And you bring up a couple of interesting points, and not to go in too many different directions at once, but the team that comes to take a look at it, really that cross-functional team, so folks that kind of work in the laydown yards, inventory management, people that actually move the product on a daily basis are just as important to the team as the business experts, and the folks that are running the financial side of the house. But then you also need to think about, well, should I incorporate people from quality? Should I incorporate people from customer service? Should I
Mhm.
incorporate, the complete supply chain aspects of my organization into the project? Because if done correctly, there are really process improvements you can look at all throughout the way, kind of the journey
Mhm.
of this implementation. And then the other point that you brought up early in this question, which I think is very important. There are lots of ways to track things, and we've seen plenty of siloed systems that were built to track assets or track product or do different activities, but they tend to lose their usefulness if they're not integrated fully back into ERP, right?
Mhm.
Because at the end of the day, the actions that you do in your ERP system should be mirrored by the tracking system and vice versa, right? So it needs to be a bi-directional communication between the two, because as I've told people in the past, if you have two systems of record, one of them is going to be wrong.
Right.
So this whole concept of having an enterprise solution tied to your tracking solution in a way that doesn't require things like duplicate entry and those types of things becomes key as well.
Do you has it been your experience that global standards are an issue, or are these types of solutions applicable as much in the United States as they might be on the European continent?
I think that's a great point as well. The standards discussion, around implementing GS1 as an example,
Mhm.
for product marking and how you build your identifiers and things like that. That is key in adoption, because one of the things that we also want to make sure that we talk about and share in a solution like this is you should think about these systems as not only useful for your company, but being able to incorporate additional partners, into the process, right? And the
Mhm.
way to do that is to speak the same language. So the use of standards and common APIs and other things that are built into the solution will make that rollout, much more successful, because it's much easier to incorporate third parties, into your process. And there are plenty of third parties that we deal with in this particular supply chain. So the easier it is to share and move that data, the better you're going to be.
One of the questions that we always get from the audience, and we thank people who are submitting questions today. We have a few minutes left, so if you're with us live today and want to submit a question, please do so in the comments section of the platform. We always hear this question: what should sort of lead the discussion? Is it the tracking of assets out at the edge, or is it the back end process? Having grown up in the ERP industry, obviously the business process is ultimately the system of record, but it's only as good as the information it knows, right? So this is really an exercise that's designed to provide the last mile of data to make that back end system as smart as possible about where products are, when to invoice, when to refund, all of those issues. Is that the right way to think about it?
It is, and I think the other question that we always get is, from I have assets in the field already, right? How am I going to get those, marked, and how do I understand where those are? And that's where you need to work on your flow, right? Through what the process looks like today. What do I have control over? Where
Mhm.
do I need to tag, kind of outside of my control, and how do I work that into the process so that I get as quickly onboarded as possible. And it is a challenge, because not everyone has the ability to start a greenfield solution with new assets as they're going out into the field. So
Mhm.
that's a study that we often undertake as well, to work with our customers on the best way to get this done.
It surprised me way back at the beginning when I came into this industry that even relatively modern businesses were still using somewhat archaic tracking mechanisms. I always love going out in the field and meeting with customers, and I can remember visiting a utility customer, talk about an industry that uses a lot of cable reels. And I met a woman at this modest-sized electric utility who was tracking the telephone poles, the electric poles, in a journal book by hand. And they were getting ready to implement ERP. And so the discussion was, okay, how many poles come in a year? How do you keep track of them? What's the process to identify those that get destroyed in a storm? And they were still doing this by hand. Uh, Knowing what you know about the cable industry, there seems like a lot of upside opportunity here. This seems like an industry that is ripe for this type of solution.
I agree 100%. I still think we have a lot of clipboard, inventory going on, right? We have a lot of manual accounting, a lot of misidentification of product that's out in the field. And again, when you get into a world where you are uniquely identifying carriers, and then you can associate product with those uniquely identified carriers, your ability to manage things at a much tighter level, and have a better understanding of flow through your supply chain. We've seen that across industries,
We've
and this industry is no different.
we're fortunate to get some questions in from the field. One that comes in is actually an interesting one. We've talked about lay down yards and harsh environments. So how do you deal with active tags in really difficult environments? I think about extreme cold and lots of wind. What's the testing to make sure that there's some durability in these tags if you're going to make the investment?
Yeah, so what we've seen, and just to be perfectly clear, the Antares Vision Group, supply chain group that I work with, we don't manufacture tags or active tags or passive tags, but we have partners that do that, and they spend a lot of time, and we spend a lot of time understanding what are the conditions that
Mhm.
these products are going to wind up in, selecting the right tag, going through that process, kind of understanding both the durability of the tag and what the expected lifespan is going to be. And it's not one tag fits all. So we go through that process of making those selections, working with the customer, doing some in-field testing with our partners, and coming up with the tags that will work best, for both the product that we're tagging as well as the environment that it sits in.
It's great, good question, and we appreciate it being submitted. I know we've discussed, John, on this program a lot of topics related to cable reel asset management, but many of the best practices you've talked about in the last 20 minutes or so are really applicable for a lot of industries. That's correct, right? People should think about returnable asset management as a general practice that can be applied pretty much to any segment where assets are moving through the supply chain.
100% correct. And the concept of learning best practices from industry to industry and then applying a holistic solution that takes into account all of those best practices, is how we think about things. And then you get into the nuances of language and individual applications and things like that. But at a macro level, what we have put together, both from a IP perspective and a product perspective, is a best practice way of managing returnable assets and being able to associate the products that are on those assets or in those assets as they move through the supply chain.
John, whenever we have these conversations, folks will often say, I work at a business, we're relatively new to this space, we manage supply chain, but we're really not at the bleeding edge. We're not even actually at the average. We're just getting going. And it feels a little daunting to think about selections of tag technology and the implementation of the necessary software like what your company offers. So how do you advise people how do they get started?
Yeah, great question. And I'm often careful. I don't like to use the pilot word, right? Because pilot has a certain connotation to it. But I think from a corporate perspective, when you sit down and look at what your supply chain looks like and then pick a representative node of that supply chain to start what I would call an initial implementation in. And then we go through that and we do it end to end, right? So we track, a collection of reels from manufacturing through distribution out to that supply chain node and back again. And I understand it's not always easy to find a closed loop and be able to process that from end to end. But I think it's very important, to get an understanding in the real world as to how these things work, and then apply that initial implementation focus to a broader audience. And if you work at it that way and incorporate the different players in the organization that we had talked about earlier to get all of their perspectives noted and understood for the project, I think you'll be much more successful in that focus.
I always like to end our programs, John, on that how do I get started question. But one of the benefits of doing a LinkedIn Live is we do occasionally get live questions in right at the end. So I want to touch on it before we jump away.
Sure.
The question is a good one, and it talks about the use of tagging in the so-called headless data collection. And I think that the term was, if you've got labor shortages in the supply chain, how do you de-risk from the labor shortage by making sure the technology can do the tracking for you? Can you comment on that?
Sure. And I think that's important, and it does speak to process, right? So if you look at what are labor intensive processes for companies, right? So oftentimes it's doing things like, cycle counting or inventory, or, moving and then recording at a later point in time when I do a shipment or a receipt. And if done properly, turning a laydown yard inventory from a full day, 3 people going out, and can be done, in minutes, right? Around how quickly can I do that inventory? Think about it from if all I had my workers that they needed to do was focus on loading trucks and not recording things, kind of later, how much more efficient would I be? And the other thing is if done correctly, I can stop things like missed shipments and understand, that this product is going to this job on this truck quickly, and then not have to spend the time, effort, labor, and cost to go, oh, I misshipped that one. Let me go retrieve that one and rush deliver a new reel to the right customer at the right point in time. All of those things really start to add up to labor shortage mitigation strategies.
So we budgeted this program for roughly a half an hour. So we're sort of coming to the end. You answered my typical last question, but I want to go back to that for just a second, because while you were reluctant to use the term pilot, and I get that, you've said in previous programs, no matter how daunting, the best advice is to get started somewhere. Just pick an aspect of the business, commit yourself, and begin, because beginning is the start of getting to a better supply chain. That's true in the cable reel industry as well, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And the focus that needs to be thought about is, I don't want to look at something that's so big that I'll never be able to get it off the ground, right?
Mm-hmm.
So having that focus strategy around picking a node of the supply chain, proving out the solution there. If you need to call it a pilot to get it through budget, we can do that. Right. But I want the people to think about this initial implementation focus, because it just gives a different thought process as to how you get there.
And of course, assemble the right team of experts. And that's why, John, it's always great for having you as a guest and to bring the expertise of your colleagues and yourself there at Antares. Thanks for being on the program as always, John.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it.
Our thanks to John DiPaolo, Chief Strategy Officer at the Antares Vision Group. You've known him from Axis, which is now part of Antares. If you'd like to reach out to John or the great team at Antares, please use their LinkedIn accounts. It's always a great way to follow John and the topics he talks about. And more information about the Diamine family of supply chain solutions can be found on the Axis website, which is up on your screen. My thanks to the great team at Antares Vision Group for bringing us today's program. And for that team, and for John, I'm your host, Bill Wall. Please join the conversation online and share the recording of this program, which will be posted on LinkedIn in a short time. And until next time, thanks for joining us, and good day.